Hey guys, I'm gonna try to end this Shirking Fort versus Elemental Aversion debate once and for all for this patch. There have been changes to Shirking Fort that have made it a lot better. I've summarized this here in terms of what you should run where, based off of if over 50% of your damage that was incoming would have to be Elemental Aversion for Elemental Aversion to be worth it. If you're above that threshold, like if more than 50% was needed, then I said Shirking Fort was better. If you're below it, then I said Elemental Aversion was better. I came to that 50% number because there's four different types of damage that can be incoming. There's ranged Ele, there's ranged physical, there is bugged Ele, which is stuff like ice damage, dots, in particular, also are bugged, which don't apply to elemental aversion. And then there's physical damage that is incoming. And if you cared about two or more of those categories, which I would say is generally you care about above more than two of those categories, and I said Shirking Fort was better. So yeah, that's where these numbers came from. Shirking Fort and Elemental Aversion are situational in terms of where they're good, but I would say Shirking Fort is generally better. The main reason why Shirking Fort is generally better than Elemental Aversion is you want Elemental Aversion ideally versus Burst. The problem is people with Burst tend to have a lot of base damage. Base damage is one of these four categories that kind of incomes into you that is stuff that will either make you take a lot more damage or a lot less damage. If you are adding to an already big number, it's going to be a lot less effective than you choosing something from a different category. So if you add to this like already big number with 5 elemental aversion, then you're just not going to make that much of a difference, which I showed down here. You will like be more tanky, but you just need a lot more incoming elemental aversion uh, for it to be effective than you would for Shirking Fort. And the thing that I realized a lot of people weren't taking into account is base damage is very, very high, just naturally from classes. If you're in light, that's like a 20% base damage bonus for reference. I have a list of those here. If you look at the base damage multiplier, which is up here, invigorated punishment's a way. If you have rune glass, or that's another way. If you have light armor, that's a way. If you have an attribute threshold bonus like 150 int, 300 int, 100 strength, 200 strength. You see that these are very, very common. They're going to be active during detonate pushes. These are very, very common to see, and it's very realistic to see a value of base damage that is about 0.3 based off of these. I would say 0.3 is very conservative. It's much higher, but even with a 0.3 value, it just illustrates that Shirking Fort is just significantly better than Elemental Aversion, which is how I came to this conclusion. Uh, but there's also other things like you have base damage that's inherent to your actual abilities in your kit, like based off what perks you take, depending on the weapon. I have that documented in my Discord if you guys want to see that. But this is what I would say you would generally want to run. In terms of coming to the math, this is again like thank you to XR and Jess for like this table that I've modified, which is or this spreadsheet. It's just made my life a lot easier than having to work with like one thing at a time, which I can do. It's just kind of less efficient than just editing a box here and everything changes. I added a little bit to it with this, but this is the big takeaway I would say is Shirking Fort is a lot better than Elemental Version. There are some things that some people would argue that Elemental Version is still better than Shirking Fort though for, and I want to address those. Elemental Version in theory would work well versus detonate pushes and like high incoming damage. In reality, it actually doesn't work that well, and it's in my opinion better to go a Shirking Fort route and just have better overall damage mitigation and then just tune your actual gems to be more oriented towards elemental aversion. Why that's good is because it's one of these other values that it's not the actual base damage value, which will mean that it's just going to be worth so much more than the base damage, which is why it just turns out to be better that way than it is to just kind of all in on the base damage because base damage is just inherently high. This is why people say that elemental version isn't what it says it is, and people say it's like, hey, 5-piece elemental version's worth like 12%. No, it's worth 15%. Everyone gets like mad over that and argues, but that's just because base damage is so inherently present into kits where elemental version just inherently does not get as much value as people think it does. In terms of other things that matter, people inherently have passive base damage from weapon kits, gems, Shirking Fort. And then when you take into everything into account, it just makes more sense to go for the Shirking Fort, I'd say. I would say the best way to kind of balance this out is to actually go for the Shirking Fort route where you stack elemental gems. I would personally do 5-piece Shirking Fort, stack elemental gems, do like a 5-15 split. If you have more weighted physical armor, you can also do some creative things too, where you could maybe run Oak Flesh because your actual old or your new Fortify that would come from the Oak Flesh would actually be useful, which is really interesting. But if you don't have that, I would probably consider still running Flame Absorption pots because that's old Fortify, and old Fortify is just really, really good, which is why there's this whole conversation in the first place of, hey, we don't really have to worry about Elemental Version anymore. We could just use old Fortify from gems. You could just keep the Flame Absorption pots and kind of work that way. Maybe run, if you do that, you can, if you want to be really creative, you could run like an Arcane Amulet to work versus Detonates, or you could run a Fire Amulet and do the Flame Absorption pots if you really care about Fire stuff still. That's just more of a preference thing. Shirking Fort, one consideration is it can be stripped. The counter argument to that is if Shirking Fort gets stripped, you can dodge right away and it will reapply again. I have heard some people say that that has a 6-second cooldown. The people that have said that are completely wrong. Tested that yesterday. You can get it stripped and they can reapply it right away. Not a concern. The main concern with it is if you're knocked down and that happens, you won't be able to apply it. And in that case, Elemental Version will still be a little bit better. The counter argument to that is if you get hit by 2 CCs while you're knocked down and get a free light roll, and you can just kind of get out of there, so it's not really that much of a concern. The other thing too is people that have Shirking Fort tend to still have freedom on those sets, and freedom is another way to kind of balance out that fact. But Shirking Fort is just significantly better than uh, actual aversion. If I look at the numbers here, you'll see that these numbers are less than the elemental version, but you have to remember this covers 4 different attributes, not just one of that incoming damage, so it just actually works out to be a lot better because it's just generally better. It's like slotting just fire resist versus slotting like general elemental resist, because the general elemental resist covers more things that can often be considered to be better than just slotting fire resist. But if you're in just a meta that only has fire damage incoming, then you probably consider doing the fire resist option, if that makes sense. It's the same sort of thing with elemental version versus physical version, and that's why Shirking Fort is still better than elemental version in my opinion. Even on last patch, it was relatively close, but with the recent buffs, it just pushes the Shirking Fort over the top. It is also noteworthy that when they said, the devs said that medium was getting a 2.5% bonus, it's actually much higher than that. It comes out to about a 4%. The reason why is they did it per actual gear piece. So you have a heavy chest, you have a heavy helm, so those are going to be 5, and then like based off of that, that's where this like 0.4 comes from. And then also in light, you also have that bonus, which is why light is actually above that 1 as well. Heavy is at the 5 that the dev said it was. But that's kind of another interesting thing where they just kind of buffed Fortify overall. They've also just inherently buffed Fortify across the board. This 4.9%, the dev said it was 4.7. Turns out it's 4.9. Uh, yeah, I don't make the patch notes. I just talk about what the changes actually were, but that's kind of embarrassing, but that's okay. But I'd say Elemental Aversion is better if you are in light, which is shown here. If you don't want to dodge, so like if you're a heavy SNS, I would consider Elemental Version to be better, mostly because you have a contingency if your stuff does get stripped, because SNS doesn't like to dodge a lot, but that's like a very, very specific case. And even then, I'm not 100% sure it's like worth it. I think Shirking Fort still could be good if you just dodge once, which often SNS players will still dodge once in a clump if it's versus detonates, because that just saves more stam, but that's kind of a preference thing. If you're versus a lot of VGs, Elemental Version can, in theory, be better. VG's been falling out of popularity. There's only like 6 to 8 slotted per war. I don't think that's really a case anymore. If you are versus people with low base damage, then it could be good. The problem is the people that are low base damage are the people that don't do damage. Like a heavy BB does not do damage, but that would be a consideration where Elemental Version would be good. So if you're versus a heavy BB, you can go for it with Elemental Version if you really care about that matchup. I don't know anyone who cares about Elemental like resistances versus a heavy BB though. They just don't hurt. Classes with surprisingly high amounts of Fortify, you could use the Shirking, or you could use Elemental Version to like kind of cushion versus when the Fortify is stripped. So that's something else to consider. That's mostly like an on point like heavy Bruiser with Whirlwind kind of thing, because Bruiser just heavy with Whirlwind just has inherently just a ton of passive Fortify. So does SNS, and that's just like a spot where it could be good. Shirking Fort I think is better, medium and heavy. Shown here to counter a variety of DPS types, which is shown in this, which I will put in my Discord if you guys want to see that, and versus people with high base damage, which doesn't even have to be that high. Like 0.3, I am like really making it in favor of Shirking Fort with 0.3. If I want to be even more favored and like lower this to 0.2, like it's still generally better to go for the Shirking Fort with a value of 0.2 in medium and in heavy. It's just kind of silly how that works because everyone has so much passive base damage that it makes sense to go for that. This number itself, it comes from Brune Glass, so that would be like with an opal, that would be 12 or 0.12. I'll start writing it down. So 0.12, this is opal. I can't type. That's opal room glass, and then you could say like roughly 0.1 to 0.15 from your actual attributes. I would say it's like 0.05-ish from weapons. That just kind of depends on which weapon that you have, and then there's also a factor here of like probably a 0.02 to 0.08 from Invig Punishment, depending on how many buffs you have at the same time. So you can see this number is bigger than 0.3. I'm just kind of trying to lean in Elemental Version's favor, because I'm trying to prove that Shirking Fort is good, and even in the best case for Elemental Version, Shirking Fort is generally good. And yeah, I'll have some of this stuff in my Discord. If you guys have questions about the sheet and whatnot, you could play around with the numbers if you care about your specific case. But I would just take away the actual table down here, or I'll add this back in so you guys can see that. But this table down here is like the main takeaway. I imagine it's going to get screenshotted and sent around, but Shirking Fort is generally better in medium and heavy now than Elemental Aversion, and due to the fact that there's no internal cooldown, which everyone thought it had, which I was wrong about originally because I didn't test that, it just makes it so Shirking Fort is just better overall, and there's no really worrisome part about going Shirking Fort where you won't have it up all the time, because you will have it up all the time. And I'll see you guys in the next video.